And you see the ultimate, the absolute disregard that this man has for his father, that he'll use his father's religion against him. And knowing that if he's going to get permission to travel, this is the one thing he can tell his father that will get that permission to travel. And so be careful of people who will try and use your religion against you. There are people who will do that. Here was Absalom, who's more than happy to do that. We see that Absalom's plot to overthrow his father is very thorough. And verse 9, the king said to him, "Go in peace." So he arose and he went to Hebron. But Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom is king in Hebron." He's got this thing plotted out. He's got this thing very, very thoroughly plotted out. Verse 11, then 200 men went with Absalom from Jerusalem, who were invited and went innocently, for they did not know anything. So here's these 200 men who go with him. It says they are innocent. That suggests they are not conspirators with him, but they are probably some of the more powerful, more prominent men of Jerusalem that he takes along with him. Why? Well, if you're going to launch a coup, it's not a bad thing to have, some of the very leading families of the city rounded up and with you, and they can either go along with you or they can become hostages. They can become hostages for good behavior from the rest of the population, from their families and their friends. And, if you want to make sure that, you're not going to get any interference, why it's good to have these folks, kind of at hand, where you can lay hands on them fairly easily. And so you see the thoroughness of his planning. He's got spies throughout all of Israel to get people stirred up. And he's got these 200 men, again, probably the leaders or prominent men of the community. And like I said, they'll either become co-conspirators with him or they'll become hostages. Verse 12, and Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gileonite, David's counselor, from his city Gilo, where he was offering the sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. So here he's also subverted David's counselor, Ahithophel. Ahithophel, his name, by the way, means brother of folly. So a lot of folks suggest that was not his real name. Ahithophel became a nickname for him. It became a kind of a smear word. I'm trying to think of a better term, kind of a mocking name for him, a name to mock him, because as we see, he becomes the brother of folly. He becomes a man of folly, but he's nearby. He's in the city of Gilo, which is nearby. Absalom's able to call on him. As we pointed out before, Ahithophel is the grandfather of Bathsheba and is probably still angry with David for how David has treated his granddaughter and her husband. He's treated them in a very callous way, in a very crude way, and brought a great deal of shame upon that family. And Ahithophel is likely still angry about that. One of the commentators suggests that Ahithophel is a very wise man, and if Absalom had possessed enough intelligence to follow his counsel, he might have easily triumphed over David. Ahithophel apparently has a really good sense of how things work, of how to make this coup a success. And if Absalom had continued and paid attention to him and continued to pay attention to him, things might have turned out differently. We see then, and we continue on then in verse 13. So then a messenger came to David and said, "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." Absalom has completely won over the men of the nation. They all see him as, yes, this is a better ruler than David. This would be a better king. You always think the grass is greener. That's the old saying. The grass is always greener on the other side. And well, if we just had Absalom to be our king instead of David, why, we'd be doing better. We'd be enjoying better prosperity. We'd be enjoying better security. Why, it's always the grass is greener on the other side. And so everybody's falling in line with Absalom, although we pointed out, if you look at David's accomplishments versus Absalom's accomplishments, David was an accomplished leader. He was an accomplished, proven leader who had led people through battle, through conflict with the Philistines, with some of these other nations. He had shown himself to be a very capable administrator. Absalom's only claim to fame was he was a celebrity. And so here we see Absalom, who is playing on his celebrity status, he simply has no experience, but he talks a good story. He has no experience, but he talks a good story, and people fall in line with being swayed by that good story. It says, then a messenger came to David, saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. David and all his servants who were with him in Jerusalem. And David said to all his servants who were with him in Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, for otherwise none of us shall escape from Absalom. Go in haste, lest he overtake us quickly and bring down calamity on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. Then the king's servant said to the king, behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king chooses. Why does David not stay and fight? Why does he not rally his army, rally his troops, and he's going to fight Absalom? Well, David knows the city is vulnerable to siege. Okay, he doesn't want a long siege of Jerusalem. He doesn't want the accompanying loss of life. And to be honest, David's position out in the open is stronger than Absalom's. Absalom's got men with him, but not the fighting men, not the army. Okay, David still has the army. And if they're walled up inside of the city, their effectiveness is greatly reduced. But if they're out in the open, why, they can attack, they can come from anywhere. They can attack or defend and maneuver. And so his strength is in the open ground. And you notice that none of his men argue with him. In fact, instead, we see the commitment of his men to him. Verse 15 is a great line for Christians today. Behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king chooses. You tell us what you want done, David, and we'll make sure it gets done. It's a great example of their confidence in him. These were men who had fought by his side. They know his capability, and they're ready to follow him. They're ready to follow him with whatever he wants to do, and provides us a good insight into David's leadership qualities. So the king, verse 16, so the king went out and all his household with him, but the king left 10 concubines to keep the house. And the king went out and all the people with him, and they stopped at the last house. Now all of his servants passed on beside him, all the Cherethites and the Pelethites and the Gittites, 600 men who had come with him from Gath, passed on before the king. And so here we see David leaving from Jerusalem. He clearly, though, plans to return. He leaves these 10 concubines, effectively 10 wives behind, who are going to keep the house in place, keep order. And so he's clearly intending he's going to return. He has every knowledge or every intention that he's going to return, because I think we don't know we don't know for sure where he's going with this. We'll look at some Psalms that he writes about this and see what he says. But it's clear that he's not considering this as being a complete abandonment of Jerusalem, but simply for the moment what we would call a tactical withdrawal. And so he's going to leave Jerusalem as indefensible and get out into the open where he has opportunity to maneuver. Verse 19, then the king said to Ittai the Gittite, why will you go with us? Return and remain with the king, for you are a foreigner and also an exile. Return to your own place. Here is this man named Ittai, who was apparently a mercenary, leader of a mercenary group. The commentators or the Bible scholars suggest he was part of this group from Gath that had been mentioned in the previous verse. That he is an exile. It says here David calls him an exile. It is possible that he had been in the service of the Philistines and is now no longer in the service of the Philistines for some reason. And instead now is coming to David's service. And David is saying, you just got here. You don't want to be involved in this. That's to David's credit. David here is, even in this moment of crisis, even in this moment of confusion, he's concerned about the welfare of the people that are around him. And so he's saying, go back. Why don't you go back to your own place, go back to your own city or whatever, and take care of yourself there. But Ittai says, verse 21, Ittai answered the king and said, as the Lord lives and my lord the king lives, surely wherever my lord the king may be, whether for death or for life, there also your servant will be. Therefore David said to Ittai, go and pass over. So Ittai the Gittite passed over with all his men and all the little ones who were with him. So you can see he's got not only his men, but he's got whole families with him. And so they are all leaving with David. David, we will find, will reward this loyalty. Later on, we will find that Ittai becomes commander of 1/3 of David's army in chapter 18. And verse 23, while all the country was weeping with a loud voice, all the people passed over. The king also passed over the brook Kidron, and all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness. So they are going out. This brook of Kidron was on the east side of the city. It was sort of the boundary line, and on the other side of that was the Mount of Olives. We're familiar with that, of course, from the days of Jesus. And they are heading east out of the city and going towards the east, towards the Jordan River. David writes a number of psalms that commemorate this retreat, this withdrawal. Let's look at a few of these. We look over in second Psalm, for example, Psalm 2. And again, we get an opportunity here that we don't always get with some of the other events of the Bible, because here we get to see the mind of David as he is encountering, or as he is enduring some of these conditions. Psalm 2, why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Let us tear their feathers apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord scoffs at them. Then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury. But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I will surely tell of the decree of my Lord. And he said to me, thou art my son. Today have I begotten thee. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as thine inheritance, and the ends of the earth as thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt shatter them like earthenware. Now therefore, O king, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence, and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, lest he become angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are those who take refuge in him. He also writes Psalm 3 at this time, and we see that even right in the introduction of that psalm. It's a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son. O Lord, how my adversaries have increased. Many are rising up against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no deliverance for him in God. But thou, O Lord, art a shield about me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. I was crying to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain. I lay down and slept, and I awoke, for the Lord sustains me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves set themselves against me around about. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten my enemies on the cheek. Thou hast shattered the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Thy blessings be upon thy people. And so here we see David. We see in these two Psalms a little bit something of David's thinking. So some of this, of course, is prophetic. We have recognized certainly Psalms 2 as prophetic about Jesus Christ. And David, of course, is in many ways that antitype of Jesus as king of Israel, and some of the things that he endured. And so we see some of the prophetic line of this. But if we especially look at the third Psalm, we see something of David's continuing reliance on God. We know David, we know David's sins, we know of David's shortcomings, and yet we still continue to see him as a man after God's own heart. Well, why is he a man after God's own heart? And the answer, I think, has to be in the fact that in spite of the sins that he committed, in spite of the troubles that he had, he continued to rely on God. We see that as a real difference between him and Saul. We see that as a real difference between him and even his own son Absalom, who David constantly relied on God. David was constantly depending on God and leaving his fate in the hands of God. And so in seeing that, we understand that David, in a moment of crisis, would always return back to his faith. He would always go back to his faith in God and look for God for guidance. We look at Psalm 61, 62, 63. I'm not going to read all of these, but I do want to look at one or two of these. Here's Psalm 61. Hear my cry, O God, give heed to my prayer. For the end of the earth I call to thee when my heart is faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I, for thou art a refuge for me, a tower of strength against the enemy. Let me dwell in thy tent forever. Let me take refuge in the shelter of thy wings. For thou hast heard my vows, O God. Thou hast given me the inheritance of those who fear thy name. Thou wilt prolong the king's life. His years shall be as many generations. He will abide before God forever. Appoint loving kindness and truth, and that they may preserve him, so that I will sing praise to thy name forever, that I may pay my vows day by day. Again, we see something here of David's reliance on God, his trust in God that this is going to turn out well for him. Especially given the fact that he has to flee from his own son. We continue on then, verse 24 of this chapter. Now then, behold, Zadok had also came, and all the Levites with him, carrying the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar came up until people had finished passing from the city. And the king said to Zadok, return the ark of God to the city. If I find favor in the sight of the Lord, then he will bring me back again and show me both it and his habitation. But if he should say thus, I have no delight in you, behold, here I am, let him do to me as seems good to him. The king also said to Zadok the priest, are you not a seer? Return to the city in peace, and your two sons with you, your son Ahimaaz and Jonathan, the son of Abiathar. See, I am going to wait at the fords of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. Therefore Zadok and Abiathar returned the ark of the God to Jerusalem and remained there. So here is Zadok. Zadok and Abiathar are apparently the leading priests of Israel at this time. Zadok, as described here by David, as being also a seer. As you know, so David's even asking him, aren't you a seer? Don't you know what's going to happen? Some of the Bible scholars look at this, suggest that Zadok was in charge of the worship service. He was sort of the high priest, while Abiathar would have been David's sort of personal chaplain. But both of these men would have been, religious counselors for him. We see that David doesn't treat the ark as some good luck charm. We saw that Saul had done that. The Philistines had done that. They treated the ark as if it was some sort of a good luck charm to be carried around with the king, wherever he went. And therefore it would be, sort of an extra measure of protection to the king. David doesn't treat it that way. David doesn't see the ark that way. By sending the ark back to Jerusalem, he makes a couple of statements. He says, first of all, if God wants me, I'll be back here. I'll be back in this city. I'll be back to see this ark, and everything will be fine. But if that's not God's will, the ark still needs to stay in Jerusalem. The ark still needs to be there, because that's essentially the presence of God. And it shows in this, once again, we see David's willingness to submit to God's authority. He's not gonna pull on the ark like some kind of a good luck charm. No, I'm gonna follow the will of God, and I'll leave it there. I'll just leave it behind. David, though, leaves Zadok and his sons. We've got these two sons and the other priests, and David is in a counter move against Absalom. David is setting up an intelligence network. I guess we would call it an intelligence network of people who are going to keep an eye on things and be able to inform him of what's going on. I'm going to let him know, here's what's going on in the city. Here's what's going on with Absalom. To kind of keep track of things, and the best way to keep track is to have somebody in close who can tell you what's going on. We see him do the same thing with one of his counselors, a man named Hushai. Hushai is probably at this point an older man. In 16 and verse 30, then David went up the ascent to the Mount of Olives and wept as he went, his head covered and walking barefoot. Then all the people who were with him each covered his head and went up weeping as they went. This was mourning. This was a mourning party as they leave from Jerusalem, grieving over what's happened to the country, grieving over what's going on. David, of course, this was an act of humility. The covering of your head, the going barefoot, this was intended to be an act of humility before God. Now someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, "Oh Lord, I pray, make the counsel of Ahithophel foolishness." Because David knows that Ahithophel is actually a very, very intelligent man, a very clever man, and David obviously is concerned about what Ahithophel may be able to counsel Absalom to do. It happened as David was coming to the summit where God was worshipped, that behold, Hushai the Archite met him with his coat torn and dust on his head. Again, this is grieving. The tearing of one's clothes and the putting of dust on one's head, that was a sign of mourning. And so here comes Hushai, who's one of David's counselors, and he is obviously grieving over what's happened. And he apparently is offering to go with David as a counselor. But David says, no. David said to him, if you pass over with me, then you will be a burden to me. He's being fairly blunt. Hushai is probably an older guy at this point, and David says, I'm not going to be able to take care of you very well. It's going to be a problem for me to be able to take care of you. And if you go with me, you're going to be a concern. He says instead, but if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant in time past, so I will now be your servant. Then you can thwart the counsel of Ahithophel for me. So again, David sets up counter moves. David sets up counter moves against Absalom. Absalom has subverted one of David's leading counselors, Ahithophel. David says, I got to have somebody in there on my side. You go back and you try to anything that Ahithophel tries to come up with, any idea he comes up with, you try to subvert it. You try to change Absalom's mind. And so it's a counterplot. He says, and are not Zadok and Abiathar the priests with you there? So it shall be that whatever you hear from the king's house, you should report to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Behold, their two sons are with me there. Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son, and by them you shall send me everything that you hear. So Hushai, David's friend, came into the city, and Absalom came into Jerusalem. So you see, David sets up this intelligence network. David sets up this. He's got now, hopefully, someone who can get inside of Absalom's sort of inner circle, into that group of trusted counselors. If he can get Hushai in there, and Hushai can then relay information to David by means of these sons of the priests. And so David set up this whole kind of on the fly. So we see something of David's command and control abilities, that he can set this plan up on the fly of getting these men to help with him and help report what's going on. All right, any question or comment about chapter 15 at this point? Here's just sort of a graphic that shows us, here's David. Of course, leaving from Jerusalem, if we recall again the story, Absalom had been up and had fled to this area up in Gilead. He had fled to that area after he had murdered his brother Amnon. He had fled up to here. It was from here that he had brought back to Jerusalem with Joel's sponsorship. He's brought back to Jerusalem. From there, he goes to Hebron, and it is at Hebron that he launches his coup against his father, to overthrow his father. He goes back to Jerusalem. David, in the meantime, this actually shows him going north. No, not really. He went east, and then he probably went east and then north, not north and then east. But the bottom line is that David will cross over the Jordan and then go up to Menahem. Ultimately, he will go up to Menahem, which is, interestingly enough, the city where Ishbosheth and the house of Saul had fled to after the death of Saul on Mount Gilboa. And now we see kind of, the next chapter is kind of, all of the craziness that comes about, that typically happens during a time of crisis like this. Because now, here in this chapter 16, we see all these strange events unfolding. Here in chapter 16, verses 1 to 4, it says, Now when David had passed a little beyond the summit, behold, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him with a couple of saddled donkeys, and on them were 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, 100 summer fruits, and a jug of wine. And the king said to Ziba, Why do you have these? And Ziba said, The donkeys are for my king's household to ride, and the bread and summer fruit are for the young men to eat, and the wine for whoever is faint in the wilderness to drink. Then the king said, And where is your master's son? That would be, of course, Mephibosheth. And Ziba said to the king, Behold, he is staying in Jerusalem, for he said, Today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me. So the king says to Ziba, Behold, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours. And Ziba said, I prostrate myself. Let me find favor in your sight, O my lord the king. So here we have this, again, you see all these bizarre events now that unfold. Here's a crisis. And what happens is that typically people, especially people kind of, people want to tend to kind of there are some groups of people that want to take advantage of a crisis. and they will use it to their own advantage. And Ziba is one of those people. He arrives with this story about how Mephibosheth is expecting to be made king of Israel. Now, if you think about that story, you kind of go, wait a minute. I see a number of problems with that story. Why in the world would Absalom, coming into Jerusalem, decide to make Mephibosheth king when it's obvious that Absalom thinks he's the best candidate for the king? I mean, the story makes no sense on its surface, and scholars continue to believe it's a lie, because when you hear Mephibosheth's explanation, which we'll see in later chapters, Mephibosheth will explain what happened, and that explanation is entirely plausible, knowing the events of the story that we know. Second of all, they point to the fact that here's Mephibosheth showing up with 2 saddled donkeys. Now, he's got supplies on them, but 2 saddled donkeys. Why would you saddle 2 of them if your master has already said, I'm not going? And so the idea is that Mephibosheth told him, hey, saddle up a couple of donkeys and let's get out of here with David. And Mephibosheth and Ziba goes, okay, I'll saddle up the donkeys, but then I'm leaving without you. So in all probability, this is Ziba making a play to improve his own position at the expense of Mephibosheth. But we see, though, that here's David, again, in a moment of crisis. David doesn't kind of think this thing through, unfortunately, and he believes Ziba's claim and then grants to him ownership of all of Mephibosheth's land, which is probably exactly what Ziba wanted. But later, of course, he'll realize, oh, I made a mistake. I probably goofed on that one. And he'll go ahead and decide to split it back 50-50 with Mephibosheth, because he can't go back all the way on his word, but he can at least go back part of the way and give Mephibosheth back something of what was taken from him by this deceit. The next episode then is we have this fellow whose name is Shimei, or Shimei, however that's pronounced. Verse 5, when King David came to Bahurim, behold, there was a man out of the family of the house of Saul whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera, and he came out cursing continually as he came. And he threw stones at David and all the servants of King David, and all the people and all the mighty men were at his right hand and at his left. Thus Shimei said when he cursed, get out, you man of bloodshed and worthless fellow. The Lord has returned upon you all the bloodshed of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. And behold, now you are taken in your own evil, for you are a man of bloodshed. Bahurim is a small village along the highway that's east of the Mount of Olives. So here's this man who comes out. He's from David's, or rather from Saul's. He's from Saul's family, and he's throwing rocks, basically ranting. This guy's just sort of a ranting, it sounds like almost a ranting lunatic at this point, throwing rocks and going crazy. This man may have been, Shimei, may have been identified as Cush, the Benjamite, in Psalm 7. So we can have a look here in a minute at Psalm 7 and get David's insights or David's impression of this event. But here's what Shimei's ranting at him. He's reflecting perhaps what many in Benjamin thought about David, that first of all, David is somehow responsible for the deaths of Saul and his sons on Mount Gilboa. You know, that's quite a stretch, because that suggests, well, David wasn't there to help Saul like he was supposed to be, and that's why Saul got killed. You can see him as being responsible for the death of Abner. Well, that was Joab, of course, that had killed Abner, but since Abner was in David's service, it could have been laid at David's feet for that reason, that David actually didn't do anything about it after the fact, and that he's also responsible for the death of Ishbosheth, which, of course, Ishbosheth was killed by a couple of his servants, but did so at the idea that they were going to be rewarded by David. So here's this man who's just essentially venting his fury on David. Here again, at a time of crisis, you get all these opportunists and the nut jobs that come out, and you see the opportunist in Ziba, and now here comes the nut job, who is this Shimei. And we see again something of David's impression of this. If we look over at Psalms, the 7th chapter. And this is again a Shiggaion of David when he sang to the Lord concerning Cush, a Benjamite. But again, many of the scholars think that this Cush, the Benjamite, is a reference to Shimei. It says, O Lord my God, in thee I have taken refuge. Save me from all those who pursue me and deliver me, lest he tear my soul like a lion, dragging me away while there is none to deliver. O Lord my God, if I have done this, if there is injustice in my hands, if I have rewarded evil to my friend, or if I have plundered him who without cause was my adversary, let the enemy pursue my soul and overtake it, and let him trample my life down to the ground and lay my glory in the dust. You see, here's David's plea. David's basically saying, I'm not guilty of this. None of this was my fault, is what his argument is. But if I am guilty in your eyes, God, then you punish me. And let me endure your punishment. He says, arise, O Lord, in thy anger, lift up thyself against the rage of my adversaries, and arouse thyself for me. Thou hast appointed judgment, and let the assembly of the peoples encompass thee, and let them return, and over them return thou on high. The Lord judges the peoples. Vindicate me, O Lord, according to my righteousness and my integrity that is in me. Oh, let the evil of the wicked come to an end, but establish the righteous. For the righteous God tries the hearts and minds. My shield is with God, who saveth the upright in heart. God is a righteous judge, and a God who has indignation every day. And so again, we see here David pleading for protection, pleading for defense, and trying to establish his own case. All right, I'm going to stop there. I got about 20 after. I'm going to stop there. We'll continue with this chapter next week. I appreciate your attention this morning.